This is not a story of glorious heroes. It's the story of the ghosts they became. Imagine following a commander considered a mad prophet by his own generals, a man who led thousands of soldiers into a living hell with a Bible in one hand and a compass in the other. What happens when the jungle strips away everything, and the only thing more dangerous than a Japanese sniper is the starving man marching behind you? You are about to discover the brutal, medieval justice used to punish a crime as simple as stealing a biscuit. Most disturbingly, you will learn the unbearable secret of what they did to the men who fell behind, a final act of mercy that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. This is a story of soldiers who endured it all, only to be betrayed and thrown away as cannon fodder by their own side. We are about to journey into one of the most controversial special operations of World War II. If you're ready for this deep dive into the absolute limits of human endurance, make sure you subscribe and hit that like button. And let us know in the comments what you think the true price of survival really is. Now, our story begins.
The air in the Delhi briefing room was thick enough to chew, a humid cocktail of cigarette smoke, sweat, and the cloying sweetness of ceiling fan oil. It was a place of maps pinned to corkboards and settled dust, where the war in Burma was discussed in the abstract terms of logistics and dispositions. Men in starched khaki, their faces etched with the weariness of a campaign going disastrously wrong, shifted in their wicker chairs. They were listening to a man who looked as though he had just wrestled his way out of the very jungle he proposed to conquer. Brigadier Ord Charles Wingate was not an easy man to look at, and he was an even harder man to listen to without questioning his sanity. His uniform seemed an afterthought, his beard untamed, and his eyes burned with the unsettling fire of a prophet. He spoke not with the clipped, confident tones of a Sandhurst officer, but with the raw, flowing cadence of an Old Testament preacher. And the gospel he preached was one of heresy. He spoke of columns, not battalions, of mules, not lorries. He painted a picture of small, self-sufficient groups of men melting into the jungle, becoming ghosts in the green.
They would march where no army had marched, supplied not by tenuous jungle tracks, but by the grace of God and the Royal Air Force, whose planes would be their lifeline from the sky. They would not take and hold ground. They would be a self-inflicted wound deep inside the Japanese war machine, a festering infection of chaos that would bleed the enemy's strength and shatter his morale. A low murmur rippled through the room. Lunacy. The word hung unspoken in the thick air. These were men who understood the jungle as an adversary, a green hell that devoured men and equipment with equal indifference. It was a place of malaria, dysentery, leeches, and 1,000 other miseries. The Japanese were masters of it, the British were not. To voluntarily march hundreds of men deep into that abyss, severing their own supply lines, it was not just unconventional, it was suicidal. Who was this man, this zealot who spoke of the Bible as a tactical manual and seemed to draw his strategic inspiration from Gideon's campaign against the Midianites? But Wingate saw what they did not. Where they saw a barrier, he saw an ocean of trees and vines, and like any ocean, it could be navigated. He had learned his craft not on the parade grounds of England, but in the rugged hills of Palestine, leading Jewish night squads. He had perfected it in the Ethiopian wilderness, leading a guerrilla force of patriots against a modern Italian army. He understood that the jungle's suffocating embrace could be turned into an advantage. It offered concealment, a cloak of invisibility that no conventional army could pierce. His men would not fight the jungle, they would become part of it. The Japanese would be searching for an army, but they would be hunted by phantoms. Was it a gamble? Of course. It was a breathtaking, audacious roll of the dice, born from a mind that operated on a plane far removed from the tidy lines on a staff officer's map. He wasn't just proposing a new tactic, he was proposing a new philosophy of war, one steeped in endurance, deception, and an almost fanatical belief in the power of a determined few. The men in the room saw a madman. But for a desperate high command, watching the empire crumble in the east, perhaps a touch of madness was exactly what was needed. The idea, once planted in the fertile ground of desperation, took root with astonishing speed. The approval came down, a string of coded telegrams that transformed a madman's vision into military directive, and so they began to arrive. They came not as eager volunteers, hand-picked for a glorious new adventure, but as whole units, bewildered and cynical, shunted onto troop trains and disgorged into the searing heat of a forgotten corner of central India. For the men of the 13th Battalion, the King's Liverpool Regiment, it felt less like a new posting and more like a sentence. They were men who had been in India for years, their resolve softened by the slow rhythm of garrison life, their faces pale beneath their pith helmets. They were clerks, dock workers, and farmers from Liverpool, not jungle assassins. Their new home was a sprawling, chaotic camp that seemed to have sprung from the red dust overnight. There were no manicured parade squares here, no whitewashed stones lining the paths. There was only heat, canvas, and the ceaseless, unnerving presence of their new commander. Wingate was everywhere and nowhere. He would appear suddenly during a route march, a small, intense figure emerging from the scrubland, watching silently before melting away. He addressed them not as a battalion, but as individuals, his words like flint striking steel, intended to spark a fire or expose a flaw. He had no time for the old army spit and polish. A man could have tarnished brass and dusty boots, but if he couldn't strip his rifle blindfolded or tell north from the stars, he earned Wingate's searing contempt. The training was a systematic dismantling of everything they knew. Marches began before dawn and ended long after dusk, covering punishing distances over terrain that shredded boots and broke ankles. They learned to cross rivers, not with neat pontoon bridges, but by flinging a rope across the churning water and hauling themselves through, weighed down by rifles and gear. Food was an afterthought, meager rations supplemented by whatever they could be taught to identify and catch in the wilderness. It was a regiment designed to do more than build muscle. It was designed to strip away the veneer of civilization, to break the soldier of the line and remake him into something primal, a creature of endurance and cunning. It was here they first heard the name he had chosen for them, the Chindits, a corruption of the name for the mythical griffin-like statues that guarded Burmese temples. They were to be guardians, predators. Many men broke. They succumbed to heat stroke, to sickness, to the sheer grinding hopelessness of it all. They vanished from the ranks, sent to backwater hospitals, their quiet disappearance a stark warning to the others. But those who remained began to change. The paleness in their faces was replaced by a deep sun-baked tan. The softness around their middles melted away, leaving lean, hard bodies. A new look entered their eyes, a quiet, watchful intensity that had not been there before. They were learning to read the land, to move silently, to trust the man next to them with their life, because soon he would be all they had. They were no longer the 13th Kings. They were being forged into something new, something harder and sharper than they had ever imagined. They were becoming Chindits, and they were beginning to understand that the hell of this training ground was merely a prelude to a far deeper inferno that awaited them in the east. The hardening of the body was complete. Now came the systematic dismantling of fear. Wingate understood a truth that was lost on the men drawing maps in Delhi. In the Burmese jungle, the most dangerous enemy was not the Japanese soldier, but the terror in a man's own mind. The fear of the unseen, the fear of being lost, the fear of the suffocating living greenness itself. So the training shifted. It moved from the sun-scorched plains into dark, tangled patches of forest that simulated the real ordeal to come. Here, physical endurance was assumed. The new currency was silence, observation, and a cold intimacy with fear. At first, the jungle was a sensory assault. The air, thick and wet, carried the smell of rot and furious growth.
The noise was a deafening, multi-layered orchestra of insects and unseen creatures, a constant shattering hum that frayed the nerves and made it impossible to think. Then there were the sudden, terrifying silences, when the entire jungle seemed to hold its breath, a sure sign that a predator, or a man, was moving nearby. Into this nightmare the Chindits were thrown, often alone.
They were sent on night navigation exercises with nothing but a compass and the faint starlight that filtered through the canopy, tasked with finding a specific tree or stream in a landscape that had no landmarks. The goal was not just to teach them to navigate, but to force them to become comfortable in the suffocating darkness, to make the unseen familiar. The true masters of this new craft, however, were not the British officers, but the quiet, hawk-eyed Gurkhas and Burmese riflemen attached to the force as instructors. These were men born to the wilderness. In one unforgettable lesson, a platoon of burly Liverpool men were tasked with tracking a single Gurkha instructor who had set off an hour earlier. After a morning of crashing through undergrowth, finding nothing but their own incompetence, they paused in a clearing, exhausted and frustrated. A moment later, the Gurkha seemed to materialize from the shadows behind them, holding up a cigarette tin one of the men had dropped 2 hours before. He hadn't said a word, but the lesson was seared into their minds. They were moving like elephants, while the enemy, and their allies, moved like smoke. Slowly, painfully, a change began. The men learned to listen through the jungle's roar, to pick out the unnatural snap of a twig from the natural fall of a branch. They learned that a flock of startled parrots was a better alarm system than a tripwire. They began to see the thick walls of bamboo not as a barrier, but as a screen to hide their movements. The perpetual twilight under the canopy that once felt like a tomb now felt like a cloak. Fear never truly vanished, but it changed its nature. It transformed from a paralyzing dread into a heightened state of awareness, a cold, sharp-edged tool that kept them alive. They were learning the brutal grammar of this new world. The green hell was no longer just an enemy to be endured. It was becoming a weapon in their hands, a sanctuary and an accomplice. They were finally ready to use it. February 8, 1943, the Chindit River. The water was a slick of black oil under a sliver of moon. There was no sound but the gentle dip of paddles and the muffled, nervous snorts of the mules packed onto crude bamboo rafts. For the men of the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade, this was the final frontier, the line between the world they knew and the abyss. Once on the far bank, inside Burma, they ceased to be soldiers in an army and became hunters, saboteurs, ghosts. The training was over. This was real. The air itself felt different here, heavier, watchful, thick with the scent of an enemy who owned this land. Wingate's grand, chaotic theory was now in motion, a force of 3,000 men and 1,000 mules stepping deliberately off the map. Once across, the world dissolved into a vertical green prison. The march was not a march, it was a battle against the terrain itself. It was hours of hauling a 70-pound pack and a rifle up hills so steep they became ladders of mud and roots, only to slither down the other side in a controlled fall. The mules, their supposed saviors, became devils of stubbornness and noise, their braying a constant threat of discovery, their hooves a treacherous clatter on hidden rock. The men learned a new kind of intimacy with the animals, a bond forged of shared misery, curses whispered into a furry ear, and the desperate need for the heavy wireless radios and explosives strapped to their backs. The jungle, which they had learned to read in training, was now speaking a more complex and hostile language. It tore at their clothes, sliced their skin with razor-edged leaves, and infected the smallest scratch with a malevolent speed. Weeks bled into one another. Then came the first contact. It wasn't a planned battle, but a sudden, heart-stopping encounter on a path no wider than a man's shoulders. A fleeting glimpse of a different uniform, a shouted warning, and the jungle erupted in a deafening clatter of automatic fire. The fight was over in 90 seconds, a brutal, intimate exchange of lead that left men gasping for air, the smell of cordite sharp in the humid air, and the first of their own lying still on the jungle floor. They were blooded. They were no longer trainees. Their true purpose was revealed when they reached the Mandalay-Mykina Railway, the steel artery that fed the Japanese 18th Division. Under a suffocating canopy of darkness, men worked with a silent, desperate efficiency, their hands sure as they packed plastic explosives around the steel rails and support bridges. There was no fanfare, only the quiet clicks of timers being set. The withdrawal was as silent as the approach. Miles away, hunkered down in a temporary halt, they felt the tremor through the soles of their boots before they heard it, a deep, rolling crump that echoed through the valleys. For a brief, glorious moment, the exhaustion and fear were forgotten. They had done it. They had severed the artery. Wingate's madness was working. This victory was confirmed days later, huddled around the crackling wireless set, listening as the faint drone of a Dakota engine grew into a roar. In a small, hastily cleared patch of jungle, they watched as parachutes blossomed in the sky, a lifeline of food, batteries, and boots sent from a world they could no longer imagine. It was proof they were not forgotten. But the radios were fragile gods, and the jungle canopy was a dense shroud. As the march pushed deeper, the crackle of the wireless would often fade to static for days on end, and the planes would not come. The ghosts were becoming truly alone. The crack of a Japanese rifle was a known quantity, a clean, sharp threat that could be understood and fought. But as the columns pushed deeper into the green labyrinth, a new enemy emerged, one that could not be seen, shot, or ambushed. It was an enemy that waged war not on the battlefield, but in the bloodstream, in the gut, and on the skin of every single man. The fear of a sniper's bullet was slowly eclipsed by the terror of a mosquito's whine, and the jungle's tactical advantages were paid for with the currency of their own flesh. The first plague to sweep through the ranks was malaria. It began with a man complaining of a headache, then a sudden, uncontrollable shivering that seemed to shake his very soul, his teeth chattering with a machine gun rhythm, even in the suffocating heat. Then came the fire, a burning, delirious fever that turned the world into a sweat-soaked nightmare of fragmented memories and monstrous shapes in the foliage. The inadequate doses of quinine did little more than turn their ears to ringing. A man in the grip of the fever was a liability, his incoherent mumbling a threat to security, his weakness a drag on the pace of the entire column. He became a passenger in his own failing body. Close behind the fever came the dysentery, a far more insidious and demoralizing foe. It announced itself with coiling cramps that doubled men over in silent agony. It was a disease of shame, stripping away dignity with a brutal, relentless urgency, forcing men to fall out of the line in a desperate, fumbling hurry. It hollowed them out, leaving them weak, dehydrated, and haunted. The meticulous water discipline they had been taught became a desperate obsession. Every sip from a stream a calculated risk. A single contaminated water source could cripple an entire column more effectively than a Japanese machine gun nest. And then there were the 1,000 smaller assaults, the leeches. After wading through a stream or pushing through damp undergrowth, the evening halt included a grim ritual of personal inspection. They were a silent, blood-hungry confederacy, found clinging to ankles, nestled in armpits, latched onto the most private parts of the body. Burning them off with a cigarette end was the preferred method, leaving a small triangular wound that refused to heal and often festered into a weeping ulcer. These jungle sores became a crippling epidemic of their own, turning a simple insect bite or scratch into a crater of infection that could lame a man for good. The unseen enemy was winning a war of attrition. The men were still marching, still fighting, but they were being consumed from the inside out by a foe that never slept and could never be defeated. They were becoming a column of ghosts in more than just name. Their bodies, the real contested territory in the heart of the Burmese jungle. There were no fronts in Burma, no battle lines drawn in the mud or grand strategies unfolding across open fields. The war here was a more intimate and primitive affair. It existed only in a 20-yard bubble of visibility that moved with a man as he walked. All the tactics of European warfare were meaningless in a place where an entire enemy platoon could be concealed behind a single curtain of bamboo 10 feet away and remain utterly invisible. This was the 20-yard war, a sudden, explosive series of disconnected skirmishes fought for survival, not for territory, in a green arena that offered both perfect cover and a perfect tomb. The encounters were never planned. They were accidents of timing and geography. A column, already weakened by dysentery and marching on legs that felt like brittle sticks, would round a bend in a narrow, muddy track and walk directly into a Japanese patrol moving the other way. The first terrible moments belonged to the point man. He was the column's eyes and ears, his senses stretched to a screaming pitch of alertness. But alertness was no guarantee. The first shot was often the only thing he ever knew of the battle, a dry, shocking crack from an unseen Arisaka rifle. Before his body had even hit the ground, the jungle would tear itself apart. The air would become a solid mass of noise and flying lead. The hammering roar of the Chindit's Bren guns, firing blind into the foliage where they'd seen the muzzle flashes, was answered by the lighter, sharper reports of rifles and the terrifying chatter of a Japanese woodpecker machine gun. There was no time for orders, no possibility of maneuver. Men dove for the meager cover offered by a rotting log or the buttress root of a giant tree, their world shrinking to that single piece of protection. It was a war of instinct, of training burned so deep it became muscle memory. Flank, suppress, move. Grenades were thrown not at targets, but at sounds. Their dull crump followed by a shower of shredded leaves and sometimes a chilling scream. Often, the fight collapsed into something truly medieval. A soldier crawling through the undergrowth to get a better angle would come face to face with an enemy doing the same. The encounter was shockingly personal. In the gloom of the jungle floor, they were not symbols of opposing armies, but two terrified men, their rifles useless at such close range. It came down to the bayonet, the Gurkha's curved kukri, or the sheer brute force of hands and boots. These were struggles of grunting, desperate strength, over in seconds. Then, as suddenly as it began, the firefight would cease. The surviving Japanese would melt back into the green, leaving behind their fallen. The silence that rushed in was more profound than before, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the sudden, indifferent chorus of the insects, resuming their song as the Chindits collected their own dead and prepared to walk on, the 20-yard bubble of war moving with them. For the men on the ground, salvation was a sound, the distant, offbeat drone of two Pratt & Whitney Wasp engines, a noise that cut through the jungle's oppressive hum and promised life. But for the young men flying the Douglas C-47 Dakotas out of the dusty airfields of Assam, that sound was the prelude to a unique and lonely form of combat. They flew without guns, without armor, and without escort, their only defense being the weather, the treetops, and the sheer, confounding vastness of the Burmese wilderness. They were the architects and maintainers of the fragile aerial bridge that made the entire Chindit concept possible, and their war was one of maps, compasses, and gut-wrenching tension. The mission began not with a charge, but with a coded wireless message from the depths of the jungle, a set of coordinates that often corresponded to nothing on their outdated maps. The challenge was immense, to find a clearing the size of a football field in a green carpet the size of England. From 5,000 feet, the jungle was a wrinkled, featureless expanse. Rivers changed course with the seasons, and the prominent hills marked on their charts were often indistinguishable from a dozen others. The navigator became the most vital member of the crew, a high-stakes artist of dead reckoning, wrestling with magnetic interference from iron-rich mountains and unpredictable winds that could push their slow, heavy aircraft miles off course in minutes. On the ground, the preparation for their arrival was a desperate, back-breaking gamble. A column, already at the edge of its endurance, would have to halt and expend precious energy hacking a drop zone, DZ, from the unforgiving vegetation. The work was loud, and the signal fires they lit, their only way of guiding the planes in, sent plumes of smoke into the sky that were as much a beacon for the Japanese as they were for the RAF. Every supply drop was an open invitation to an ambush. From the cockpit, spotting that wisp of smoke or the glint of a signal mirror was a moment of pure relief. Then, the most dangerous phase began. The Dakota would descend, skimming the treetops at a terrifyingly low altitude, the wings seeming to brush the canopy. The air inside the fuselage became a whirlwind of noise and motion. The cargo doors were removed, and at the command, the kickers, men braced against the hurricane-force wind, would physically shove hundreds of pounds of supplies into the void. The color-coded parachutes blossomed behind them, red for ammunition, blue for medical supplies, green for rations. For 2 or 3 passes, the Dakota was a slow, predictable target, utterly vulnerable to any enemy soldiers who might be closing in. The pilots could sometimes see the firefights, the muzzle flashes winking in the gloom below, a stark reminder that they were not just delivering cargo, they were flying directly into the heart of the 20-yard war. Then, empty and climbing for the safety of altitude, they would head for home, leaving the ghosts below to reclaim their lifeline and melt back into the green. Their survival guaranteed for another few days by this revolutionary and profoundly dangerous act of faith from the sky. The jungle could strip a man of his weight, his health, and his dignity. But the deepest fear, the one that gnawed at the column commanders in the quiet, desperate hours before dawn, was that it could also strip a man of his humanity. As rations dwindled from meager to non-existent, and the gnawing agony of starvation became the single, overwhelming reality, a new enemy arose. This foe didn't carry a rifle or lay ambushes. It lurked behind the eyes of the man marching in front of you and in the dark corners of your own heart. It was the animal instinct to survive at any cost. In this world, where a single biscuit was more precious than gold, the ultimate crime was not cowardice or dereliction of duty, it was theft. To steal another man's rations was to steal the minutes of his life, a betrayal so profound it threatened to dissolve the invisible bonds of trust that held a column together. It was a cancer that, if left unchecked, would consume the unit from within, turning a disciplined fighting force into a pack of starving, suspicious animals. Wingate knew this. His orders on the matter were absolute, and the justice he sanctioned was as primitive and unforgiving as the landscape itself. There were no military courts here, no lengthy appeals. Justice was meted out on the spot. The scene, when it happened, was unforgettable. A man from a rifle company, caught with a small, pathetic hoard of stolen hardtack, was brought before his column commander. There was no trial. The evidence, a canvas bag heavy with the proof of his betrayal, was laid on the ground. The rest of the column was assembled, their faces hollowed by hunger and fatigue, their eyes watching with a terrible, silent intensity. They felt not outrage, but a cold, grim understanding. They all knew the temptation. The commander, a man who had led these soldiers through firefights and forced marches, spoke in a low, flat voice. His words were not about military law, but about the covenant of their shared survival. Then came the sentence. The man's shirt was removed, his hands tied to a tree. The instrument of punishment was a thick leather belt. The sound of it cutting through the humid air, followed by the dull, wet slap against skin and bone, was a sound more sickening than gunfire. The men watching did not flinch. This was not about cruelty. It was a brutal but necessary surgery. They were cutting out the rot before it could spread. The flogged man was then untied and ordered to take his place back in the line.
He would march with his pain and his shame, a living testament to the one law that could not be broken. The column was everything. The individual, when he threatened the whole, was nothing. Every column had a medical officer, a man armed not with a rifle, but with a canvas bag containing morphine, field dressings, and a series of impossible choices. He was often a young doctor, trained in a world of sterile operating theaters and the clear-cut ethics of the Hippocratic Oath. That world was a distant fairy tale memory. Here, his consulting room was a patch of muddy ground slick with blood, and his primary duty was not to the individual patient, but to the collective health of the column. He was not just a healer, he was the final arbiter of a man's utility, the one forced to make the cold, brutal calculation of who could be saved and who had become a fatal liability. The triage after a firefight was a swift, heartless piece of theater. The walking wounded were dealt with first. A bullet through the fleshy part of an arm, a face peppered with shrapnel, these were patched up with a practiced efficiency. The men were given a grim nod and sent back to their positions in the line, the shock on their faces hardening into a grim resolve. If you could stand, you could march. If you could march, you could fight. It was as simple as that. There was no sympathy to spare for manageable pain. The real test came with the men who could not get up. In the green hell, a shattered leg or a deep abdominal wound was not just an injury, it was a death sentence. There were no ambulances, no field hospitals, and the slim, miraculous hope of an evacuation by a light aircraft was a lottery ticket that few ever won. To attempt to carry a gravely wounded man on a makeshift stretcher was to condemn the entire column, slowing its pace to a crawl and making it a perfect stationary target for the Japanese patrols that hunted them relentlessly. Everyone knew the rule: the pace of the column was the pace of the swiftest. This was where medicine ended and a terrible, pragmatic mercy began. The medical officer would approach the fallen man, his face an impassive mask that hid the turmoil within. He and the column commander would exchange a quiet, knowing glance. No order was ever spoken aloud, but the understanding was absolute. The MO would kneel, his hands gentle as he administered one final, generous dose of morphine. He was not just easing the pain of the wound, he was providing relief from the agony of being left behind. The official story was that these men were left with what rations could be spared and a loaded pistol. The quiet, unspoken truth was far darker. As the column moved out, the men would not look back. They couldn't. Every man knew that if his luck ran out, the same unbearable choice, the same grim mercy would be extended to him. It was the final, most brutal piece of their conditioning, learning not just how to face their own end, but how to walk away from a friend's. From the sky, Burma was an unbroken, unreadable ocean of green. The aerial photograph, the single most important intelligence tool of the war in Europe, was rendered useless by the dense, triple-layered canopy. To the planners in Delhi, the Chindit columns were moving blind, isolated ships in a vast, hostile sea. But on the jungle floor, a different, more ancient form of intelligence was at work. It did not rely on cameras or radio intercepts, but on whispered words, on the loyalty of local tribesmen, and on a network of brave men who knew the jungle not as an obstacle, but as a home. The Chindits were not entirely alone. They had eyes and ears that belonged to the land itself. The key to this network was the men of the Burma Rifles. Composed of indigenous Karen, Kachin, and Chin soldiers led by British officers who had spent decades in the country, they were the bridge between the alien world of the Chindits and the complex human terrain of Burma. They understood the dialects, the customs, and the silent language of the jungle. A British officer could see only an impenetrable wall of vegetation. A Kachin sergeant could read a story in a bent twig, a misplaced stone, or the sudden alarm call of a forest bird. They were the guides who could find the secret, almost invisible trails that bypassed Japanese garrisons, and the interpreters who could discern truth from deception in the cautious answers of a village headman.
The risks for these local allies were astronomical. The Japanese military administration, the Kempeitai, ruled by terror. A village suspected of aiding the British could be wiped from the face of the earth, its inhabitants subjected to horrific reprisals. Yet still, they helped. A lone farmer hoeing his small paddy field would make a subtle gesture as a Chindit patrol passed, indicating the direction of a recent Japanese patrol. In the depths of the night, a village elder would risk everything to share a bowl of rice and a quiet warning about an impending enemy sweep. These were not grand acts of heroism, but small, treasonous whispers that carried the weight of a death sentence. This human intelligence transformed the Chindit operations from a blind charge into a series of calculated strikes. A column, exhausted and on the verge of walking into a prepared ambush, would be met on the trail by a lone scout who would materialize from the foliage, his message brief and urgent. A new route would be taken, a disaster averted. A raid on a supply dump was made possible only by the detailed sketch of its layout, drawn from memory by a local man who worked there. This was the true unseen war, a conflict of whispers, loyalty, and immense courage waged by the people of Burma. The Chindits were the mailed fist, but the network of human intelligence was the nervous system that guided it. A web of whispers in the canopy that was the difference between a calculated blow and a blind, suicidal stumble through the dark. The lessons of the first 1,000-mile march had been paid for in blood, misery, and the emaciated bodies of its survivors. Longcloth had been a proof of concept, a brutal but successful experiment. Now, in the spring of 1944, Ord Wingate, promoted and backed by the highest echelons of Allied command, was being given the chance to write the second, far larger chapter. This would be no mere raid. This would be a clandestine invasion, a bold and unprecedented vertical assault deep into the heart of enemy territory. The plan had a name as mundane as a day of the week: Operation Thursday. There would be no long attritional march from India this time. The Chindits would arrive by air. The spearhead of the invasion would be delivered not by parachute, but by a fleet of flimsy, powerless aircraft that inspired little confidence. The American-made Waco CG-4A glider was little more than canvas and plywood stretched over a skeleton of steel tubing and prayer. A fragile box designed for a one-way trip. Crammed inside these flying coffins were not just soldiers, but mules, pack artillery, and even American Army engineers with their small bulldozers, all to be towed through the night over mountains and enemy lines. The night of March 5, 1944, was a scene of organized chaos at the airfields in Assam. A vast, unheard-of armada of C-47s was lined up, each tethered to a glider, the tow ropes lying like thick snakes on the tarmac. Inside the gliders, the men sat in grim silence, packed shoulder to shoulder in the suffocating darkness. They could hear the roar of the tow plane's engines, feel the shuddering vibration as the flimsy craft was dragged down the runway and clawed its way into the air. For hours, they were helpless passengers, tossed by turbulence, their fate entirely in the hands of the tow pilot and the thin rope connecting them. Then came the moment of commitment. A loud, solid thunk echoed through the fuselage as the tow rope was released. The deafening engine roar was replaced by an eerie, whistling silence, the sound of wind rushing over the canvas skin. Below them was nothing but an impenetrable blackness they were told was a clearing code named Piccadilly. The American pilots, with nerves of steel, wrestled the gliders down, aiming for a patch of darkness they had only seen on a reconnaissance photo. "Brace! Brace! Brace!" The final shout from the cockpit was followed by a symphony of destruction. The shriek of tearing fabric, the sickening crunch of plywood splintering against unseen obstacles, and the violent, bone-jarring impact as the glider skidded, slewed, and crashed to a halt. Men, dazed and injured, scrambled out into the chaotic darkness, surrounded by the wreckage of other gliders. They had not crept across a river, they had fallen from the sky. The most audacious gamble of the Burma campaign had begun. For 19 days, Operation Thursday had been a testament to Orde Wingate's relentless will. The strongholds had been established, the airstrips carved from the jungle, and his Chindits were beginning to tighten their stranglehold on the Japanese supply arteries. Wingate himself was a whirlwind of motion, a current of electric energy flowing between the jungle fortresses. He would land at a newly built airstrip in a light plane, his presence instantly galvanizing the tired defenders. He moved through the camps with his strange, loping gait, asking sharp, incisive questions of one officer, offering a rare, almost shy word of encouragement to a young private, his mind already 3 steps ahead of everyone else's. He was the brain, the heart, and the fanatical soul of the entire enterprise. On March 24, 1944, after visiting the Aberdeen and White City strongholds, he was due to fly back to his headquarters. The weather, however, was turning. The sky to the west was stained a bruised purple, and the humid air was heavy with the promise of a ferocious storm. The American pilots of the B-25 Mitchell bomber assigned to transport him were wary, but Wingate's impatience was legendary. The war did not wait for the weather, and his plans were urgent. Against the quiet advice of the aircrew, the decision was made to fly. From the ground, the men watched the bomber take off, a powerful, reassuring symbol of their connection to the outside world, carrying the one man they believed to be invincible. It climbed steadily, banked, and headed west towards the cloud-wreathed hills that formed the border with India, vanishing into the growing storm. At headquarters, the radio operator listened to the routine check-ins, his hand resting on the dial. Then there was only static. Minutes ticked by, stretching into an hour. The B-25 was officially overdue. A quiet, gnawing anxiety began to permeate the command post. The search began immediately, but the terrain was unforgiving, the weather atrocious. For days, there was only silence. Then the wreckage was spotted, a devastating splash of silver metal high on a jungle-clad mountainside. There were no survivors. The news, when it finally crackled over the wireless sets in the jungle strongholds, was a coded message that seemed to drain the very air from the lungs of those who heard it. The reaction was not one of loud grief, but of a profound, stunned silence. The men looked at each other, their faces etched with a disbelief that slowly hardened into a desolate understanding. Their prophet, the architect of their world, the one man who understood the mad logic of their mission, was gone. The Chindits were suddenly and irrevocably orphaned, a headless army deep in an ocean of enemies, left to wonder what would become of them now. The shock of Wingate's absence was followed by a more insidious poison, uncertainty. The Chindit force had been more than an army. It had been a cult of personality, an instrument perfectly tuned to the will of its eccentric creator. With him gone, a profound and immediate vacuum opened up. The command passed to Brigadier Joe Lentane, a capable officer, but a man who possessed neither Wingate's prophetic fire nor his powerful political connections. And the Chindits were about to discover how desperately they needed that protection, because their fate now rested in the hands of a man who despised everything they represented. Command of the Northern Combat Area, which encompassed the Chindits' operations, belonged to U.S. General Joseph Viner Joe Stilwell. He was a tough, abrasive, ground-pounding infantryman who believed wars were won by taking hills and killing the enemy in straightforward, attritional battle. He viewed Wingate as an erratic and dangerously unprofessional showman, and his Chindits as a private, undisciplined circus. Stilwell saw thousands of elite troops operating on what he considered a strategic vanity project, and he had his own, far more conventional plans for them. The shift in command was not a gradual transition, it was a violent slamming of a door.
Wingate's grand strategy of causing chaos, of being a festering ulcer in the Japanese rear, was discarded overnight. Stilwell looked at the Chindit strongholds not as bases for raiding, but as fixed positions on his own tactical map. He looked at the mobile columns not as ghosts in the green, but as 3 brigades of infantry that he could use to bludgeon the Japanese forces blocking his own advance toward the city of Myitkyina. The new orders that crackled over the wireless sets were met with disbelief and horror. The Chindits were no longer to raid, evade, and disrupt. They were ordered to undertake set-piece attacks against heavily fortified Japanese positions. They were to capture and hold terrain, the very thing they were specifically not equipped or trained to do. Columns armed with little more than light machine guns and mortars were commanded to perform frontal assaults on bunker complexes that would have required heavy artillery to crack. It was a fundamental betrayal of their purpose. They were a rapier being used as a cudgel. The men, who had endured disease, starvation, and the 20-yard war, now faced their most hopeless battle, fighting a conventional infantry war without conventional infantry support, under a commander who neither understood nor valued their unique capabilities, and who was perfectly willing to see them bleed for every yard of ground. They were no longer Wingate's visionaries. They were Stilwell's cannon fodder. For the lucky few, survival did not arrive as a moment of triumphant victory, but as a slow, bewildering return to consciousness in a world made of clean white sheets and the quiet rustle of a nurse's starched uniform. To be evacuated from the jungle was to be wrenched from one reality and dropped into another. The first taste of real food, the first feel of a soft bed. These were not comforts, but profound, jarring shocks to a system that had been pared down to the animal essentials of march, fight, and endure. But as the initial delirium faded, a horrifying truth began to dawn on both the survivors and the doctors who treated them. You could take the man out of the jungle, but you could not take the jungle out of the man. They began to arrive in the hospitals of India looking like escapees from a medieval famine, skeletal figures with gaunt, ancient faces and eyes that held a deep, haunting emptiness. Their bodies were archives of misery, covered in jungle sores, their skin a jaundiced yellow from chronic malaria. But their ailments were more than just the sum of their parts. A man would be treated for dysentery only for a violent malarial fever to rack his body a week later. He would recover from that, only to find himself crippled by nutritional deficiencies like beriberi that made his legs swell and his heart falter. The doctors soon gave it a name, a diagnosis born of helplessness, Chindit syndrome. It was a vicious, synergistic complex of pathologies, a complete and total exhaustion of the body's resources. The combination of prolonged starvation, chronic amoebic dysentery, and relapsing malaria had created a condition for which there was no simple cure. The body, having run on sheer nervous willpower for so long, seemed to collapse the moment it sensed safety, revealing the catastrophic damage within. But the deepest scars were the ones that no X-ray could find. These men could not settle. The comfort and quiet of a hospital ward at night was a source of terror, a screaming void where the familiar, chattering hum of the jungle should have been. A dropped tray in the corridor would cause them to flinch and dive for cover that wasn't there. They startled at shadows, their minds forever scanning the manicured hospital gardens for ambush sites and sniper positions. They were haunted by what they had seen, and worse, by what they had been forced to do. The friends left behind, the brutal choices made in the name of survival. They had won. They had made it out. But the war had rewired their very souls, leaving behind a permanent, invisible tremor. The physical wounds might eventually close, but the scars within, the complex of a ravaged body and a haunted mind that was Chindit syndrome, would be a life sentence. When the last of the skeletal survivors of Operation Thursday were airlifted out of the jungle, their bodies ravaged and their minds haunted, the question began to echo in the corridors of command from Delhi to London. In the final analysis, what had been achieved? The butcher's bill was staggering. The Chindit force, a full division of elite and highly trained troops, had for all intents and purposes ceased to exist. For the thousands of men lost not just to enemy action, but to sickness, starvation, and the sheer grinding exhaustion of the campaign, the tangible results seemed pitifully small. A few temporary strongholds, a handful of broken railway lines, and a modest disruption of Japanese supply columns. To many conventional commanders, men like the pragmatic and brilliant General Slim of the 14th Army, the Chindits were a strategically unsound extravagance. They had diverted precious air transport resources, the most critical commodity in the entire theater, away from the main front. They had operated as a private army, draining the regular forces of high-quality officers and men, only to be squandered in battles that, in Slim's view, had little bearing on the main effort. The Chindit campaign, to its critics, was a story of immense courage and endurance expended for a pittance of tactical gain. It was a handful of broken bridges in exchange for a division of broken men. But the true impact of the Chindits was not measured on a map, but in the mind of the enemy and in the future of warfare. The first expedition, Longcloth, despite its horrific cost, had been a thunderclap to Allied morale. It shattered the carefully cultivated myth of the Japanese soldiers' invincibility in the jungle. It proved that British, Indian, and Gurkha troops could not only survive behind enemy lines, but could carry the fight to them in their own backyard. This psychological victory was incalculable, injecting a new, aggressive spirit into an army that had known only defeat. More importantly, the Chindit success created a deep and abiding paranoia within the Japanese high command. The fear of another, larger long-range penetration force materializing in their rear became an obsession. This fear was a primary catalyst for their decision to launch the disastrous Yugo offensive in 1944, a desperate attempt to capture the Allied bases at Imphal and Kohima and thus prevent a repeat of the Chindit invasions. The Japanese fatally overextended their supply lines and were annihilated by the 14th Army in the decisive Battle of the Burma Campaign. The Chindits, in essence, were the strategic bait that lured the Japanese army into a fatal trap. Their greatest victory was one they never knew they'd won, achieved by forcing the hand of their enemy. This, combined with their revolutionary blueprint for air-supplied, deep-penetration warfare, the direct ancestor of modern special operations, was their true and costly legacy. They returned not to victory parades or cheering crowds, but to a world that had largely forgotten them. The war in Burma was a distant, sweaty affair that held none of the stark, familiar drama of the European theater. To a nation rebuilding from the Blitz, the Chindit story was too strange, too remote, and too brutal to easily comprehend. For decades, many of the survivors did not speak of what they had endured. How could you explain the gnawing totality of starvation to someone who had only known rationing? How could you describe the intimate terror of the 20-yard war, or the silent, terrible choices made when a man could no longer keep pace? So they remained silent, carrying their war within them, a private ghost in a world eager to celebrate peace. They were alienated from the normal run of life, but they were never truly alone. They had each other. In the smoky back rooms of pubs and in quiet community halls, the Chindits found their true home, the old comrades associations. Here, there was no need for explanations. A man's hollowed-out look, his sudden flinch at a loud noise, his lifelong aversion to rice, it was all understood. They were bound together not by the memory of battles won, but by the shared, unspoken secret of what it felt like to be truly hungry, by the memory of the fevers, the leeches, and the weight of a friend's last look. It was a brotherhood that transcended rank, a bond forged in the absolute crucible of shared suffering, exclusive to the few who had paid the ruinous price of admission. In these quiet gatherings of old men, the ghost columns marched again. They were spectral figures who had haunted the Japanese army, and who were, in turn, haunted for the rest of their days by what they had seen and done. Their strategic legacy would be debated by historians, their tactics studied by future special forces, but their deepest, most profound legacy was a human one. They were a testament to the absolute, terrifying limit of human endurance. They were a measure of how much a body and a soul could withstand when stripped of everything but the will to place one foot in front of the other. The jungle had taken nearly everything from them, but it had also given them a strange and final gift.
Many veterans would later confess that after Burma, they never truly felt fear again. The mundane anxieties of civilian life seemed trivial, almost comical.
What was a financial worry compared to starvation? What was a social embarrassment compared to the intimate violence of the jungle? They had walked through the worst of all possible worlds and had, against all reason, emerged on the other side. They had paid the highest price imaginable, and in surviving had purchased a kind of quiet, unshakable peace that few could ever hope to comprehend.